Vanishing Point. What about Vanishing Point? Vanishing Point for Photoshop versions, by the way, earlier than Photoshop CC. Some functionality discussed in this article may be available only if you have Photoshop Extended, and Photoshop doesn't have a separate Extended offering, and all features in Photoshop Extended are part of Photoshop, by the way. And Vanishing Point simplifies perspective correct editing in images that contain perspective plans. For example, the size of buildings, walls and floors, or any rectangular object in Vanishing Point. You specify the plans in an image and then apply edits such as painting and cloning and copying or pasting and transforming, and all your edits honor the perspective of the plans you are working on. And when you retouch and add or remove content in an image, the results are more realistic because the edits are properly oriented and scaled to the perspective plans. And after you finish working in Vanishing Point, you can continue editing the image in Photoshop, by the way, to preserve the perspective plan information in an image, and you can to save your document in BSD and TIFF and or JPEG format, like this screenshot. This image now explains for you how to making edit on the perspective plans in an image. And you can also measure objects in an image and export 3D information and measurements to DXF and 3ds formats for use in 3D applications. And what about Vanishing Point dialog box overview? The Vanishing Point dialog box, you should to select filter and then select Vanishing Point to contain the tools for defining the perspective plans and tools for editing the image and a measure tool and an image preview and the Vanishing Point tools like Mercue and Stamp and Brush and others, and behave similarly to their counterparts in the main Photoshop toolbox. And you can also use the same keyboard shortcuts and to set the tool options and opening the Vanishing Point menu to display additional tool setting and commands. Like this screenshot, this image now explain for you Vanishing Point dialog box. And we have A and B and C and D and E. A is meaning Vanishing Point menu, and B options and C toolbox, and D preview of Vanishing Point session, and E is meaning zoom options. And what about Vanishing Point tools? Vanishing Point tools is meaning Vanishing Point tools behave like their counterparts in the main Photoshop toolbox, and you can also use the same keyboard shortcuts for setting tool options and then selecting a tool changes that available options in the Vanishing Point dialog box. And we have options. The first option, edit plan tool. Edit plan tool, you should to select and edit and moves and resize plans. And second option, create plan tool. Create plan tool is meaning defines the four corner nodes of a plan and adjusts the size and the shape of the plan and tiers of a new plan. And third option, Mercue tool is meaning makes square or rectangular selections and also moves or clones selections. And then double clicking the Mercue tool in the plane selects the entire plane. And the fourth option is Stamp tool. Stamp tool is meaning paints with a symbol of the image, unlike the clone stamp tool. And the stamp tool is in Vanishing Point can't clone elements, by the way, from another image. And you have to see also paint with sampled pixels in Vanishing Point, pointed, and retouch with the clone stamp tool. And next option, brush tool. Brush tool is meaning paints a selected color in a plan. And next option, transform tool. Transform tool is meaning scales and rotates and moves a floating selection by moving the bounding box handles, and its behavior is similar to using the free transform command on a rectangle selection. And second option, eyedropper tool. Eyedropper tool is meaning selects a color for painting when you click in the preview image. And the second option, measure tool. Measure tool is meaning measures, distances, and angles of an item in a plan. And the second option, zoom tool. Zoom tool is meaning magnifies or reduces the view of the image in the preview window. And the second option, hand tool. Hand tool is meaning moves the image in the preview window. And so what about magnify or reduce the preview image? Magnify or reduce the preview image. You should do any of the following. You should select the zoom tool, and after that in the vanishing point dialog box, and then click or drag in the preview image to zoom in, and hold down is Alt if you use Windows, or Option if you use macOS, and then click or drag to zoom out. After that, specify a magnification level in the zoom text box at the bottom of the dialog box. After that, click the plus sign or minus sign button to zoom in or zoom out, respectively. After that, to temporarily zoom into the preview image, hold down the X key. This is especially helpful for placing the corner nodes when defining a plan and for working on details. How to move the image in the preview window. How to move the image in the preview window. You should do any of the following. You should select the hand tool in the vanishing point dialog box, and then drag in the preview image. And after that, hold down the space bar with any tool selected, and then drag in the preview window. Sorry, in the preview image. And how to work in Vanishing Point. Work in Vanishing Point is meaning we have steps. We have steps in this point. Work in Vanishing Point. Optional. Prepare your image for work in Vanishing Point. Before choosing the Vanishing Point command, do any of the following. To place the results of your Vanishing Point work in a separate layer. First, create a new layer before choosing the Vanishing Point command, then placing the Vanishing Point results in a separate layer. Preserve your original image, and you can use the layer opacity control and the stylus and blending modes, by the way. And after that, if you plan to close the content in your image beyond the boundaries of the current image size, increase the canvas size to accommodate the additional content. And after that, if you plan to paste an item for the Photoshop clipboard into Vanishing Point, copy the item before choosing the Vanishing Point command, and the copied item can be from a different Photoshop document, by the way. And if you are copying type, you must resize the text layer before copying to the clipboard. After that, to confine the Vanishing Point results to specific areas of your image, either make a selection or add a mask to your image before choosing the Vanishing Point command. After that, to copy something in perspective from one Photoshop document to another. First, copy the item while in Vanishing Point is one document, and when you paste the item in another document while in Vanishing Point, the item's perspective is preserved, by the way. Step number 2. You should choose filter, then choose Vanishing Point, and step number 3, define the 4 corner nodes of the plane surface. And by default, the Create Plan tool is selected successfully, and then click in the preview image to define the corner nodes, and then try to use a rectangle object in the image as a guide when creating the plan. And to tear off additional plans, you can use the Create Plan tool and Control Drag if you use Windows, or Command Drag if you use macOS, and Edge Node, like this image and this screenshot. The first image here now explain for you defining the 4 corner nodes with the Create Plan tool, and the second one, Control Drag if you use Windows, or Command Drag if you use macOS, and Edge Node to tear off a plan. Step number 4, edit the image. How to edit the image? You should do any of the following again. You should make a selection. Once drawn, a selection can be cloned and moved and rotated and scaled and filled or transformed for detailed information. You should see about selections in Vanishing Point. After that, paste an item from the clipboard, and the pasted item becomes a floating selection, which conforms to the perspective of any plan that is moved into. For detailed information, see also based on item into vanishing point. After that, paint with color or sampled pixels. Paint with color or sampled pixels for detailed information. It's also the previously, see paint with a color in vanishing point or paint with sampled pixels in vanishing point. After that, scale and rotate and flip and flop and or move a floating selection like a previous. And the measure an item in a plan. Measurements can be rendered in Photoshop by choosing render measurements to Photoshop from the vanishing point menu, by the way. Step number 5. Export 3D information and measurements to TIFF or 3ds format. And textures are also exported, by the way, to 3ds format. And for the detailed information, like the previous, see export measurements, textures, and 3D information again. And number 6, click OK. And grids can be rendered to Photoshop by choosing render grids to Photoshop from the vanishing point menu before you click OK. How to export measurements? How to export measurements, textures, and 3D information. By the way, 3D information, plans, textures, and measurements created in vanishing point can be exported to a format for use in CAD modeling, animation, and special effects applications, by the way. And exporting to DXF creates a file with 3D information with any measurements. And the exported 3ds files contain rendered textures in addition to the geogrammatic information. We have steps. Step number 1. You should open the vanishing point menu and then choose either export to DXF or export to 3ds. Step number 2. In the export DXF or export 3ds dialog box, you should select a location for the saved file and then click save. About perspective plans and the grid. What about perspective plans and the grid? Before you can edit in vanishing point, you define rectangular plans that line up with the perspective in an image, and the accuracy in the plan determines whether any edit or adjustments are properly scaled and oriented in your image. And after you establish the 4 corner nodes, the perspective plan, by the way, is active and displays a bounding box and a grid. And you can also scale, and you can scale and move or reshape to fine tune the perspective plan. And you can also change the grid size so it lines up with elements in the image. And sometimes lining up the bound box and grid with the texture or pattern in your image helps you accurately match the image's perspective. And adjusting the grid size can also make it easier for you to count items in the image. And besides helping to line up the perspective plans with images elements, the grid is helpful for visualizing measurements when used with the measure tool. And an option is available to link the grid size to measurements you make with the measures tool. Define and adjust perspective plans in vanishing point. So what about define and adjust perspective plans in vanishing point? We have steps. Step number 1. In the vanishing point dialog box, you should select the create plan tool firstly, and then click in the preview image to add the 4 corner nodes, and then try to use a rectangular object or a plan area in the image as a guide when creating the perspective plan. To help with node placement, hold down the X key to zoom into the preview image, and as you add corner nodes, you can delete the last node if it's not correct by pressing the backspace key if you use Windows, or delete key if you use macOS. And you can also reposition a node by dragging it. Step number 2. Select the edit plan tool and do one of the or more of the following. To reshape the perspective plan, drag a corner node And after that, to drag the grid, you should to enter a value in the grid size text box, or click the down arrow and move the slider again. And you can also adjust the grid size when the create plan tool is selected successfully. And after that, to move the plan, you should to click inside the plan and drag. And after that, to scale the plan, drag and an edge node in a segment of the bounding box, like this screenshot now. And this image, by the way, explain for you, dragging an edge node to increase the size of a plan to accommodate your edits. And the bounding box, by the way, and the grid of a perspective plan is normally blue, and if there is a problem with the placement of the corner nodes, the plan is invalid, by the way, and the bounding box and the grid turn either red or yellow. And when your plan is invalid, move the corner nodes until the bounding box and grid are blue. And if you have overlapping plans, control click if you use Windows, or press command click if you use macOS to cycle through the overlapping plans, like these screenshots. Overlapping plans here now. And how to create related perspective plans. How to create related perspective plans. By the way, after creating a plan in Vanishing Point, you can create tear off additional plans that share the same perspective. Once a second plan is torn off from the initial perspective plan, you can tear off additional plans from the second plan, and so forth. And you can also tear off as many plans as you want. And also new plans tear off at 90 degrees angles. You can adjust them to any angle. This is useful for making seamless edits between surfaces, by the way, and matching the geometry of a complex scan. For example, corner cabinets in a kitchen. Corner cabinets in a kitchen can be part of a continuous surface, by the way. And in addition to adjusting the angle of a related perspective plan, you can always resize the plan using the edit plan tool. We have steps. Step number 1. You should select the create plan tool firstly, or edit plan tool, and control drag if you use Windows, or command drag if you use macOS. And edge node of an existing plan's bounding box, not a corner node, by the way. And the new plan is turn off at 90 angle to the original plan. Note again, if a newly created plan doesn't properly line up with the image, you should select the edit plan tool and adjust the corner node. And when you adjust one plan, a connected plan is affected, by the way, and the corner nodes are unavailable if more than 2 plans are connected, like this screenshot. This image now explains for you. Tearing off multiple plans keeps the plans related to each other, so your edits are scaled and oriented in the proper perspective. Step number 2, optional. Do one of the following to change the angle of the newly turned off plan. By the way, with either edit plan tool or create plan tool selected, alt drag if you use Windows, or option drag if you use macOS, and the centered edge node on the side that's opposite from the axis of rotation. And should enter a value in the angle text box, and should move the angle slider, like this image, change plan angle. And note again, note and be careful. Once you create a new child plan from an existing parent plan, you can no longer adjust the angle of the parent plan, by the way. And bounding box and grid alerts in Vanishing Point. What about bounding box and grid alerts in Vanishing Point? By the way, the bounding box and grid change colors to indicate the plan's current condition. If your plan is invalid, and move a corner node until the bounding box and grid are blue. We have options here now. Blue is meaning indicates a valid plan, by the way, and keep in mind that a valid plan doesn't guarantee results with the proper perspective, and you must make sure that the bounding box and grid accurately line up with geogrammatic elements or a plan area in this image. And red Red is meaning indicates an invalid plan, and the vanishing point cannot calculate the plan's aspect ratio. And yellow is meaning indicates an invalid plan also, and some vanishing points of the plan cannot be resolved. Note and be careful. Also, it's possible to edit an invalid red or yellow plan, and including tearing off perpendicular plans, the result will not be oriented properly. How to show or hide the grid and active selections and perspective plan boundaries. You should choose edges from the vanishing point menu firstly, and note and be careful. Selections temporarily show when they are resized or repositioned, even if show edges is turned off. What about adjust the spacing of the perspective plan grid? Adjust the spacing of the perspective plan grid. You should do any of the following again. You should select the edit plan or the create plan tool and then enter a grid size value in the tool options area. After that, select the measure tool and then select link measurements to create in the tool options area, and drag the measure tool in a plan and enter a length value in the tool options area. How to render grids to Photoshop. By default, the vanishing point grids are invisible when viewing an image in the Photoshop document window, and even so, the grids are preserved in the image and appear whenever you launch Vanishing Point, and the grids can be rendered. So when you finish working in Vanishing Point and they are visible in the Photoshop document window, and the rendered grids are a raster not vector, by the way, and you should open the Vanishing Point menu and choose Render Grid to Photoshop, and the Render Grid to Photoshop command must be chosen for each Vanishing Point session, by the way. And you should create a new layer for your Vanishing Point results. If you plan to render the grids to Photoshop, this keeps the grids on a separate layer from the main image, by the way. So what about selections in Vanishing Point? By the way, selections can be helpful when you are painting or retouching to correct flows and add elements or enhance an image in the Vanishing Point, and making selections lets you paint or fill specific areas in an image while honoring the perspective defined by the plans in the image. And selections can also be used to clone and move specific image content in perspective. And using the marquee tool in Vanishing Point, you draw a selection within a perspective plan, and if you draw a selection that spans more than one plan, it wraps to conform to the perspective of each plan, by the way. And once a selection is drawn, you can move it anywhere and in the image and maintain the perspective established by the plan. And if your image has multiple plans, by the way, the selection conform to the perspective of the plans moved through. And the Vanishing Point also lets you clone the image pixels in a selection as it's moved in an image. And in Vanishing Point, a selection containing image pixels that you can move anywhere in the image is called a floating selection, and also not on a separate layer, and the pixels in a floating selection theme to be a separate layer hovering above the main image. And while active, a floating selection can be moved and rotated or scaled. Note and be careful. When you paste an item into Vanishing Point, the posted pixels are in a floating selection, by the way. And clicking outside a floating selection, deselect it. And once deselected, a floating selection's content is pasted into the image, replacing the pixels that were plugged. And cloning a copy of a floating selection also deselects the original. Like this image and this screenshot now, pasted item in Vanishing Point. And Vanishing Point has another move option for selections, and you can fill the selection with pixels from the area where the pointer is moved, by the way. Like the next screenshot, copying a selection and moving a selection from one perspective plane to another. and how to make selections in Vanishing Point. How to make a selections in Vanishing Point, we have steps. Step number 1, you should select the marquee tool. Number 2, optional again, in the tool options bar area, enter values for any of the following settings before making the selections. And you have options in this point. We have options again. Feather. So what's the meaning of feather? Feather is the meaning specifies how much to blur the edges of the selection. Opacity is the meaning specify this value if you plan to use the selection to move image content, and this option by the way determines how much the moved pixels obscure or reveal the image underneath. After that, Heal menu. Heal menu is the meaning choose a blending mode if you plan to use a selection mode to move image content. This option by the way determines how the moved pixels blend with the surrounding image. And you should choose off so the selection doesn't blend with the colors and the shadows and the texture of the surrounding pixels. And you have to choose also luminance to blend the selection with the lighting of the surrounding pixels. And also you have to choose on to blend the selection with the color and the lighting and a shading of surrounding pixels. And step number 3, drag the tool in a plan. Drag the tool in a plan. You can also make a selection that spans more than one plan, and hold the shift key to constrain the selection to a square that's in perspective, by the way. And selection spanning more than one plan here. Note and be careful. To select an entire plan, double click the marquee tool in the plan. How to move selections in Vanishing Point. How to move selections in Vanishing Point. We have steps. Step number 1, you should to make a selection in a perspective plan, firstly. And next, step number 2, choose one of the following from the mode menu to determine the behavior when you move a selection. To select the area, you move the selection marquee to choose destination, and to fill the selection with the image pixels in the area where you drag the selection tool pointer to same as control dragging or command dragging a selection. Then choose source. Step number 3, drag the selection. Hold down the shift key to constrain the move so it's aligned with the grid of the perspective plan. How to move and rotate or scale. How to move or rotate and scale floating selections. How to move and rotate and scale floating selections. You should do any of the following. To move a floating selection, you should to select the marquee or transform tool. Then click inside the selection and drag. After that, to rotate a floating selection, you should to select the transform tool and move the pointer near a node. And when the pointer changes to a curved double arrow, and drag to rotate the selection. And you can also select the flip option to flip the selection horizontally and along the vertical axis of the plan, or select the flip option to flip the selection vertically along the horizontal axis of the plan. And we have images here now. Look at these 3 images. We have A and B and C. This explain for you how to transform tool options. A is move and B rotate and C scale. To scale a floating selection, you should to make sure that is a perspective plan and select the transform tool and move the pointer on top of a node. And when the pointer changes to a straightened double arrow, drag to scale the selection, then press the shift key to constrain the aspect ratio as you scale, and press Alt if you use Windows or Option if you use macOS to scale from the center. And what about field selections with another area of an image? Field selections with another area of an image. We have steps. Step number 1, you should to make a selection in a perspective plan firstly. Number 2, optional, you should to move the selection where you want it, and make sure that the move is set to destination. And when you move the selection, step number 3, do one of the following. Control drag if you use Windows or Command drag if you use macOS, and the pointer from inside the selection to the image area that you want to fill the selection. And after that, choose source from the move mode menu and drag the pointer from inside the selection to the image area that you want to fill the selection. And the file selection becomes a floating selection that you can scale and rotate and move or clone using the transform tool, or move or clone using the marquee tool. And you have images here now. This screenshot now explain for you. Control dragging if you use Windows, or command dragging if you use macOS. And the selection, we have A is meaning original selection, and B is meaning moving the selection to the source image, and C is meaning the source image fills the original selection. How to copy? Copy selections in Vanishing Point. How to copy selections in Vanishing Point? We have steps. Step number 1. Make a selection in a perspective plan firstly. After that, Alt drag if you use Windows, or Option drag if you use macOS again, and the selection with the marquee tool to create a copy of the selection and its image pixels. And the copy becomes a floating selection, by the way, and which seems to hover above the main image, and you can move a floating selection, or you can select the transform tool to scale or rotate the floating selection. And number 3, you should do any of the following. You should click outside the floating selection to deselect, and the selection's content is pasted into the image and replacing the pixels that were blurred. And then click in the floating selection with either the marquee or transform tool, and Alt drag if you use Windows, and Option drag if you use macOS again, to make another copy. And once copied, the original floating selection is deselected and replaces the pixels that were blurred. And pressing Control Shift T if you use Windows, and Command Shift T if you use macOS, and duplicates your last duplicating move. And this is an easy way to clone content multiple times, by the way. How to paste an item? How to paste an item into Vanishing Point? How to paste an item into Vanishing Point? By the way, you can paste an item from the clipboard in Vanishing Point, and the copied item can be from the same document or a different one. And once pasted into Vanishing Point, the item becomes a floating selection that you can scale and rotate and move or clone. And when the floating selection moves into a selected plan, it conforms to the plan's perspective, by the way. And like this screenshot, this image now we have A and B and C. And pasting this image explained for you, pasting an item into Vanishing Point, and the A is meaning copied pattern from a separate document, and B is meaning image with selection, and to confine results and created in Photoshop before opening Vanishing Point, and the C is meaning pasted pattern in Vanishing Point is moved into the plan and honor the selection. For convenience, it's recommended that you create perspective plans in a previous Vanishing Point session. We have steps again. Step number 1. You should copy an item to the clipboard firstly, and the copied item can be from the same or different document. And keep in mind that you can paste only a raster, not vector item, and be careful. If you are copying type, by the way, you must first resize that, and right click then the text layer and choose resize, then choose select. After that, choose all and copy to the clipboard. Step number 2, optional. You should create a new layer. Step number 3, choose filter, then choose Vanishing Point. Step number 4, if necessary, you should create one or more plans in the image. Step number 5, you should press Ctrl V if you use Windows, or Command V if you use macOS, to paste the item. And the pasted item is now a floating selection in the upper left corner of the preview image. By default, the marquee tool is selected. Step number 6, you should use the marquee tool to drag the pasted image to a plan. and the image conforms to the perspective of the plane, by the way. And note and be careful. After pasting the image in vanishing point, don't click anywhere in the image with the marquee tool except to drag the pasted image to a perspective plane, and clicking anywhere else deselect the floating selection and permanently pastes the pixels into the image. How to paint? How to paint with a color in vanishing point. How to paint with a color in vanishing point. We have steps. Step number 1. You should select the brush tool firstly. After that, number 2. Specify a brush color by doing one of the following. Select the eyedropper tool and click a color in the previewed image. After that, click the brush color box and open the color picker to select a color. Step number 3. In the tool options area, set the diameter and brush size and hardness and edge smoothness and opacity and the degree to which painting obscures the image below. Step number 4. Choose a healing mode. You should choose a healing mode to paint without blending with the color lighting and shading of the surrounding pixels. Choose off. And to paint and blend the strokes with the lighting of the surrounding pixels while retaining the selected color. Choose luminance. And to paint and blend with the colors, lighting and shading of the surrounding pixels, you should choose on. And number 5, optional again. You should specify the paint application options to paint continuously, automatically conforming to the perspective from one plane to another, and open the vanishing point menu and choose allow. Choose allow multi-surface operations, and turning this option off lets you paint in the perspective of one plane at a time, and you need to stop and then start painting in a different plane to switch perspective. To confine painting to the active plane only, open the vanishing point menu and choose clip operations to surface edges, and turning this option off lets you paint in perspective by beyond the boundaries of the active plane. Step number 6. Drag in the image to paint. When painting in a plane, the brush size, by the way, and shape scales and orients properly to the plane's perspective, and shift drag constrains the stroke to a straight line that conforms to the plane's perspective. And you can also click a point with the brush tool and then shift click another point to paint a straight line in perspective. The brush tool honors marquee selections and can be used to paint a hard line along the edge of the selection. For example, if you select an entire plane, you can paint a line along the perimeter of the plane. And what about paint with sampled pixels? How to paint with sampled pixels in Vanishing Point? How to paint with sampled pixels in Vanishing Point? In Vanishing Point, by the way, the stamp tool paints with sampled pixels, and the cloned image is oriented to the perspective of the plane you are painting on. And the stamp tool is useful for such tasks as blending and retouching image areas and cloning portions of a surface to paint out, and an object, or cloning an image area to duplicate an object or extend a texture or pattern. We have steps. Step number 1. In Vanishing Point, select the stamp tool. Step number 2. In the tool options area, set the diameter, brush size and hardness, and the amount of feathering on the brush, and opacity, and the degree that the painting obscures or reveals the image beneath it. Step number 3. Choose a blending mode from the Heal menu, and to prevent in this step, to prevent the strokes from blending with the colors and the shadows and the textures of the surrounding pixels, choose off. After that, to blend the strokes with the lightening of the surrounding pixels, choose luminance. After that, to blend the strokes with the color lighting and the shading of surrounding pixels, you should choose on. Step number 4. To determine the sampling behavior of the stamp tool, select Align to sample pixels continuously and without losing the current sampling point even when you release the mouse button. After that, deselect Align to continue using the sampled pixels from the initial sampling point each time you stop and resume painting. Step number 5. Optional. Specify the paint application options to paint continuously from one plane to another. Open the Vanishing Point menu and choose Allow multi-surface operations. Anyway, and to confine painting to the active plane only, open the Vanishing Point menu and choose Clip operations to surface edges. Step number 6. Move the pointer into a plane and Alt-click if you use Windows or Option-click if you use macOS to set the sampling point. Step number 7. Drag over the area of the image you want to paint and hold the Shift key down to drag a straight line that conforms to the plane's perspective. And you can also click a point with the stamp tool and then Shift click another point to paint a straight line in perspective. So what about measure? Measure in Vanishing Point. Measure in Vanishing Point is meaning users ranging from architects and interior decorators for forensic and woodworkers, and often need to know the size of objects in an image. And in Vanishing Point, the measure tool lets you, by the way, draw a measurement line over an object in a perspective plane that you know the size of. And the measure tool has an option for entering a length for the measurement, and the measurement line displays two text boxes, by the way, and one for the length and one showing the angle that the line was drawn relative to the perspective plane. And once the measurement and its length have been set, all subsequent measurements correctly scale to your initial measurement. And there is an option for linking the line measurement length with the grid spacing of the perspective plane. For example, a measurement length of 5 causes the grid to display 5 spaces, and when the link option is selected, this might be useful for visualizing sizes in the image or for counting objects in an image. And when unlinked, the grid spacing can be adjusted independent of the measurement. This option, by the way, is useful in such instances where you find that the grid spacing is too small and visual confusing when linked to the measurement. The measurements you create, by the way, can be rendered so they appear in the image after you close the Vanishing Point dialog box. And you can also export your measurements and geogrammatic information to formats that can be read by CAD applications. So what about measure objects in an image? Measure objects in an image. We have steps. Step number 1. In Vanishing Point, you should select the measure tool and then click and drag over an object in a plane. And it's best to make your initial measurement of an object that you know the size of. And be careful. Once you start creating a measurement from within a plane, it's possible, by the way, to continue drawing the measurement beyond the plane boundaries. Step number 2. With the measurement selected, enter a length value to set its measured length. And step number 3. Optional again. Draw additional measurements, and the size of these measurements are scaled to the size of your initial measurement. Step number 4. Optional again, one of the following. If you want the size of the grid to be independent of the length value you assigned to the initial measurement, make sure link measurements to grid is deselected. This is the default setting, by the way. And if you want the size of the grid to adjust according to the length value you assigned to the initial measurement, select link measurements to grid. And the Vanishing Point measurements in an image are preserved after closing the dialog box, by the way, and they appear when you launch Vanishing Point again. How to automatically drawing a measurement in Vanishing Point. How to automatically drawing a measurement in Vanishing Point. By the way, the measurement tool, the measure tool, can automatically draw the length and width measurements of a surface that's defined by a perspective plane. And double click the measure tool in a perspective plane. And how to move a measurement in a Vanishing Point. By the way, in Vanishing Point you can move a measurement line without changing its orientation, angle or length. And we have steps again. Step number 1, you should select the measure tool. And step number 2, click anywhere along the length of an existing measurement and drag. And how to change the length or orientation of a measurement. How to change the length or orientation of a measurement. By the way, you can change the length or orientation angle of an existing measurement. We have steps. Number 1, you should select the measure tool and move it over the end point of an existing measurement line. Number 2, to change the orientation and length of a measurement, you should drag an end point. After that, to change the length of measurement and constrain its angle, changes to 15 degree increments. And control drag if you use Windows, or command drag if you use macOS, and end point. After that, to change the length of a measurement without changing its orientation, alt drag if you use Windows, or option drag if you use macOS, and end point. After that, and finally, to change the orientation of a measurement without changing its length, shift drag and end point. How to delete a measurement in Vanishing Point. If you would like to delete a measurement in Vanishing Point, what should you do? You should select the measurement firstly and press backspace, Windows only, or delete. And how to show or hide measurements in Vanishing Point. You should open the Vanishing Point menu and choose show measurements. And how to render measurements in Photoshop. What about render measurements in Photoshop? By the way, the Vanishing Point's measurements are invisible when viewing an image in the Photoshop document window, and even so, the measurements are preserved in the image and appear whenever you launch Vanishing Point. Measurements, by the way, can be rendered, so when you finish working in Vanishing Point, and they are visible in the Photoshop document window, and the rendered measurements are raster, not vector. And actually, you should open the Vanishing Point menu and choose render measurements to Photoshop. And the render measurements to Photoshop command must be chosen for each Vanishing Point session, by the way. And you can create a new layer for your Vanishing Point results if you plan to render the measurements to Photoshop. This keeps you, by the way, this keeps the measurements on the separate layer from the main image.